Recently I decided to try a game that I've been avoiding for years, and that game is Hollow Knight. I have heard so many incredible things about it, but I've been hesitant because of the fact it's a Metroidvania game, and that's a genre I have always struggled with. A couple of years ago I played Salt and Sanctuary, and broadly speaking I had a pretty good time with it, until I lost interest in it. I found it to be less intense on the gatekeeping side and a little easier to navigate than games I'd tried or watched streams of in the past, and it helped that it played much more like a Souls game than I'm used to seeing in this genre. However, after a while, finding my way forward got to the point where it felt so much like a chore that I couldn't be bothered to play any longer. Nonetheless, the experience did warm me to the genre a little, and so, last month, being at a loss of what else to play, I decided to finally try out Hollow Knight. On the face of it, it's an excellent game, and I have found it to be a strangely meditative experience. What with the simplistic, often undersaturated art style that occasionally gives way to bursts of colour that lend the game a sense of beauty and put a smile on my face, add to that the subdued and often even peaceful soundtrack that seems to evoke hauntingly calming emotions in me, and the stage is set for me to have a really good time. The audio-visual combo on display here gives a sense of wonder and helps to draw you into the world. The combat took me a little while to get used to, but once I did, it was, for the most part, very satisfying. Once I felt I had learned the mechanics, I found ways to exploit enemy attacks and in order to take them down effectively. There is good variation in enemy type, and some of the boss fights are incredibly fun. I'm thinking about Soul Master here as a particular highlight, which had me smiling as I started to get into the rhythm of the fight after a few attempts. That said, there are times when the game's combat overwhelms you in a way that's kind of hard to deal with. Since you can only move on a 2D plane, there is no opportunity for sidestepping or creating empty space to manipulate enemy AI, and the amount of time it takes to heal in this game means that during certain fights, healing is all but impossible. This one fact caused me to just ignore 2 different boss fights completely, and a challenging room that may or may not be optional, because I got so frustrated with it that I did not want to continue. The platforming is enjoyable. It starts off relatively simplistic but soon ramps up in difficulty, and there are some very difficult sections interspersed throughout the map that can take quite a few attempts to get through. Exploration was enjoyable too. I really liked how areas linked together at times, and the experience arriving in new areas was occasionally awe-inspiring. However, I found that the longer the exploration went on, the more difficult it got, which brings me on to my primary criticism not just of this game, but of the genre in general, and the main point of this video. Metroidvania games just feel like too much of a memory test to me. Being specific to Hollow Knight, the root of this problem is in how the game seems to deliberately make it hard to keep track of where things you found are, and that really annoys me. Let me explain. Initially, you don't have a map at all, but then soon you get given a quill and parchment on which to write down your map. This is something that your character does automatically as you explore, and the updated routing is written to your map every time you sit down on a bench to rest. Provided, of course, you have purchased a map of the area from the map seller. Why do you have to buy a map from a cartographer, but still have to write it yourself? Don't know. Let's move quickly on. The problem is that you only have the layout and very specific things added to your map, like locations of shops and benches that you can rest on as 2 examples. You don't have any icons or text added to your map for unexplored locations where you are missing a special ability, need a key or other special item in order to progress in that direction. To keep track of anything else, you have to make use of a limited amount of coloured pins that you can add to the map. And although you get more as the game progresses, there is never enough. So what happens is you soon run out of markers that you use to keep track of things that you didn't want to forget. And even then, after a while, you can't remember what they were marking anyway, because the different colours and unmemorable pictures on the pins do little to help you distinguish between them. Putting a pin in a map is completely pointless unless you're able to know its purpose by looking at its icon, because there are many different reasons for adding one to the map, and you're not able to add any text to these icons either. So what I ended up doing is giving up on using them completely, because after a while I had a map full of pins and no idea what any of them represented. Something that further exacerbates the problem is that fast travel points have different names on them than the names of the areas they reside in, and the unique map showing their locations doesn't have any names on it, and doesn't seem to match up with the regular map in any way. So sometimes I had to fast travel 2 to 3 times to find where I wanted to be. To me, all of this seems like such a massive developmental oversight that the only possible explanation I can think of is that it's deliberate. To what end though, I really can't fathom. Alright, so at this point I'm trying to give myself a reality check by asking myself, are my feelings way off base here? Do people really like these systems that mean you have to remember so much? Or is it that people enjoy forgetting because they like to re-explore the same areas repeatedly so that they can find these places again? Or could it be that most people just have much better memory for this kind of thing than I do? I'm interested in your point of view on this. If you feel like sharing, get into the comment section below and let me know what you think about all this. Let's talk about it. For me though, the question of whether it's a problem is absolutely clear. I really don't want to have to visit the same areas over and over again, trying to find things that I previously found and then forgot existed. Mechanically, this is also known as backtracking, which is an aspect of game design that used to be widespread 20 years ago, but the industry has moved on since then, and for very good reason, because people get bored of it very easily, myself included. If I've already seen it, I want to move on, and if I have to move back through an area I've already been to, I want it to be quick and easy. I don't want to have to struggle to find things. I feel the same way about finding things in games as I do in real life. If it takes me longer than 2 minutes to find something in real life, I start to get frustrated to a degree that might look like an overreaction to some. But such is my aversion to looking for things that it quickly causes my blood to boil. So for me, the navigation is a pain point that hampers the experience, dulling my enjoyment, breaking my immersion, and making me feel a sense of dread about progressing in the game. To be clear, it's not that I mind revisiting old areas in general, that can actually be quite fun. It's just that on subsequent visits to an area, I'm going there for a particular reason, and I want to get straight to it. I don't want to have to keep going over it with a fine tooth comb. Once is enough for that. It's a shame because I feel like there's a lot to love, not just with Hollow Knight, but with the Metroidvania genre in general. It's really cool to have an interconnected world that links together in ways that delight and surprise you. It's essentially a form of 2D open world, and the freedom it allows without it being bloated like modern open world 3D games is a breath of fresh air. Now, in 2024, more than ever before. The change in perspective, literally, from being restricted to a 2D plane in a world saturated with 3D titles provides a fundamentally different type of experience to exploring a 3D world, and there's a lot to be said for that. It can also add a figurative change in perspective to your gaming experiences. They do say variety is the spice of life after all. And on a personal note, I grew up playing 2D games. When I was young, 3D games did not exist. So honestly, I do have something of a fondness for this type of experience. It's just that the games I grew up with were typically much more linear affairs, with not a great deal of room for deviation from a fixed path, which is a type of game design I still prefer today in both 2D and 3D games. So what do I think could be done to improve the situation for me and others who may feel the same as me? Well, firstly, I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that the main character is quite literally carrying pen and paper. Gameplay aside, what sense does it make from an immersion standpoint that your character, who is exploring an unknown, strange and dangerous environment, to create a map for themselves as they progress, but neglect to make coherent notes on the things they find, instead choosing to draw a limited number of abstract pictures across the map? Don't get me wrong, I understand world building and wanting to make the elements of your game design all feel like they make a coherent whole, but at the end of the day you do have to prioritise the player experience. It's a frustrating design. At the very least they could remove the limit and make the icons things that are more memorable, like a sword or boss icon and such like, You know, the standard ones that all open world games have. Even better, give us the total freedom of letting us write our own notes on the map. That would be way more fun too. I had a great time in Valheim doing just this. The pins in that game are also not enough to represent everything you want to remember, although they are still a little better than Hollow Knight, but you can just write any text you want along with the pins. It also means that by the time you're deep into the game, you have that deeply personalised touch to your own map, which I find adds meaningfully to the experience. Another alternative would simply be to just automatically add more things to your map. It doesn't even need to be that complicated or specific. It could just be adding the text locked door or unreachable or spikes or boss. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a game that demonstrates this well. It just puts the word blocked path on your map without giving any details about why it's blocked. This means it doesn't spoil an ability you haven't yet obtained, while making it so you don't have to attempt to remember that it exists and where it is located. There is also unexplored path, so you can see the places you haven't actually progressed past yet but do currently have the ability to pass. This functionality added to Hollow Knight would vastly improve the navigation that in its current form becomes more and more overwhelming and frustrating the longer the game goes on. To me, this just seems like game design 101, to design your game in a way that your players are able to keep track of what they found, especially in a world this sprawling and complicated. After years of pondering, I feel like I've finally been able to pin down what it is I don't like about this genre. It's really only through writing the script for this video that I finally feel like I have clarity on where the problem lies, and it's really just mainly the navigation aspect. It's way too complicated and I don't like backtracking, and if it's necessary for gameplay, you could at least make it easy for me to find things I have already found once before. I have no patience for the extreme overwhelm that comes from looking at a map with no indication of where to go next and feeling the dread of having to check a whole bunch of different places one by one to try and find a new path forward. That's the kind of experience that will kill a game for me very quickly. The nail in the coffin came when I found a new path that was overwhelmingly difficult and I wanted another option to go explore first and come back to it later, but I didn't have another path in mind and zero idea from looking at the map where to even start. All my mental leads had dried up and I haven't played the game since, except to capture some footage for this video, that is. It's like the exact opposite of the overwhelm I feel when looking at a map in an open world game where there's too much on the map, that I can barely see the art design of the map for all the icons stuffed into all the available space, and the demand avoidance part of my brain just goes, no thanks, I'll go do something else. Like so many things in life then, it's all about balance. And so I realised that the only reason I played as much Hollow Knight and Salt and Sanctuary as I did was because in the early stages navigation isn't really an issue, because you can't really miss new areas. But as the map gets bigger, it becomes harder to find new places to go to as the complexity of the world reveals itself. Even as I work on finalising this script, I find myself zooming out a little mentally and trying to think of this from a new perspective. I do wonder whether the fact the game is 2D plays its role here as an important factor in the difficulties I am experiencing. Is 2D less memorable than 3D because the lack of extra dimension reduces how varied the areas can look, and due to the lesser number of distinguishing features that normally aid memory formation, things become harder to remember? I certainly didn't have the same problems remembering where most things are in games like Dark Souls, for example. That's not to say I never forgot things in that game, but it was far less frustrating to find them again. On the other hand, could it be that Metroidvania worlds are interconnected to an extent far beyond any 3D worlds are, and therefore simply harder to memorise? People praise games like Dark Souls for being interconnected, but compared to this, Dark Souls seems barely connected. Or is that just in my head? Is it just some kind of fallacy about the way my brain perceives a 2D game world compared to a 3D one? Is something about the change in dimensions making it seem different in some way?
It's fine to be undead, but keep a level head, eh?
Either way, it seems clear to me that compared to 3D games, this genre has a more labyrinthian level design ethos that makes it incredibly complicated to play. In general, I do find this line of reasoning rather fascinating, as we're now in the territory of the psychology of gaming, and I'm going to be pondering this at quiet moments in the weeks to come. However, it doesn't change how I feel, and at the end of the day, if I wanted a game to be a memory test, I would just play chess.